Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 9 of our complete practice question series for the SAA-C03 AWS Certified Solutions Architect Associate Exam. Choose your answer before the timer ends, then review the correct answer, explanation, and exam tip. Let us begin part 9. Question number 289. A medical imaging archive uses S3 standard for the first 180 days. During days 181 to 360, images are infrequently read but must remain resilient across availability zones. From day 360, retrieval must be immediate even though the data is archival. After 5 years, auditors may wait up to 12 hours for a restore. Data loss from an availability zone failure is unacceptable. Which lifecycle sequence is the most cost-effective? Option A. Transition to S3 standard IA after 180 days. S3 Glacier Instant Retrieval after 360 days, and S3 Glacier Deep Archive after 5 years. Option B. Transition to S3 One Zone IA after 180 days, S3 Glacier Instant Retrieval after 360 days, and S3 Glacier Deep Archive after 5 years. Option C. Transition to S3 Standard IA after 180 days, S3 Glacier Flexible Retrieval after 360 days, and S3 Glacier Deep Archive after 5 years. Option D. Transition to S3 One Zone IA after 180 days, S3 Glacier Flexible Retrieval after 360 days, and S3 Glacier Deep Archive after 5 years. The correct answer is A. Transition to S3 Standard IA after 180 days, S3 Glacier Instant Retrieval after 360 days, and S3 Glacier Deep Archive after 5 years. Here's why. Standard IA preserves multi-availability zone resilience during the infrequent access phase. Glacier Instant Retrieval provides millisecond access after day 360, and Deep Archive offers the lowest cost long-term tier with retrieval options compatible with a 12-hour audit window. Why are the other options not correct? B. One Zone IA does not satisfy the requirement to withstand an availability zone loss. C. Glacier Flexible Retrieval does not provide immediate access after day 360. D. This option fails both the multi-availability zone resilience and immediate retrieval requirements. Exam tip. Map each lifecycle stage to the exact access latency, resilience, and retention requirement. Question number 290. An enterprise has 1,500 employees whose identities and group memberships are maintained in an on-premises Active Directory. Employees must access AWS without receiving separate long-term AWS credentials, and existing directory administration must remain the source of access decisions. Which design meets these requirements? Option A. Create an IAM user and access keys for every employee. Option B. Create cross-account roles and map them to groups without configuring a directory authentication mechanism. Option C. Configure SAML 2.0 federation and map Active Directory groups to IAM roles with the required permissions. Option D. Create an Amazon Cognito user pool and duplicate all Active Directory users in the pool. The correct answer is C. Configure SAML 2.0 federation and map Active Directory groups to IAM roles with the required permissions. Here's why. SAML federation authenticates employees through the existing corporate directory and maps group membership to IAM roles that issue temporary AWS credentials. Why are the other options not correct? A. IAM users create a second identity and long-term credential lifecycle for every employee. B. Roles alone do not authenticate users from Active Directory without federation. D. Cognito user pools are primarily for application users and would duplicate the workforce identities. Exam tip. Use Enterprise Federation to map directory groups to IAM roles and issue temporary AWS credentials. Question number 291. A streaming publisher serves different license catalogs from application load balancers. The catalog a viewer may receive is determined by the viewer's country or geographic region, not by measured network distance. Which Route 53 policy should be used? Option A. Geoproximity routing. Option B. Geolocation routing. Option C. Weighted routing. Option D. latency-based routing. The correct answer is B, geolocation routing. Here's why. Geolocation routing selects records according to the requester's geographic location, allowing explicit country or region-based content entitlements. Why are the other options not correct? A. Geo-proximity routes according to resource and user distance with optional bias, not explicit distribution right boundaries. C. Weighted routing divides traffic by configured percentages and does not enforce location rules. D. Latency routing chooses the lowest latency endpoint rather than the legally permitted catalog. Exam tip. Use geolocation routing for explicit country-based rules and geo-proximity routing for distance-based traffic bias. Question number 292. A design studio needs to move a growing on-premises file repository to Amazon S3 over its network connection. The migration service must automatically verify data integrity during and after transfer. Which solution best meets the requirement? Option A. Deploy S3 file gateway and rely on normal cache synchronization as the bulk migration process. Option B. Enable S3 transfer acceleration and build a separate checksum validation workflow. Option C. Use AWS transfer family to expose an SFTP endpoint and manually compare uploaded files. Option D. Deploy an AWS data sync agent on premises and configure a task that transfers the repository to S3. The correct answer is D. Deploy an AWS data sync agent on premises and configure a task that transfers the repository to S3. Here's why. AWS Data Sync provides managed online transfer from on-premises storage to S3 and performs built-in integrity verification, retries, and transfer monitoring. Why are the other options not correct? A. File Gateway provides ongoing hybrid file access rather than the most direct managed bulk migration and validation workflow. B. Transfer Acceleration improves upload paths, but does not provide a complete managed validation process. C. Transfer Family provides managed protocol endpoints, but would still require manual migration and integrity logic. Exam tip. Use data sync when online migration requires managed transfer and built-in integrity verification. Question number 293. An organization operates S3 buckets across many accounts and regions. Applications frequently use multi-part uploads, and the FinOps team needs an organization-wide report of incomplete multi-part upload object counts and storage consumption with minimal administration. Which service should the team configure? Option A. S3 Storage Lens. Option B. An AWS Config Organization Rule. Option C. An S3 Multi-Region Access Point. Option D. An Organization Service Control Policy. The correct answer is A. S3 Storage Lens. Here's why. S3 Storage Lens aggregates storage metrics across accounts, buckets, and regions, and includes metrics for incomplete multi-part uploads that can reveal avoidable storage cost. Why are the other options not correct? B. AWS Config evaluates resource configurations and does not inventory incomplete multi-part upload parts. C. Multi-region access points route S3 requests and do not provide this cost report. D. SCPs restrict permissions and cannot generate storage usage metrics. Exam tip. Use S3 Storage Lens for organization-wide S3 usage and cost optimization visibility. Question number 294. A retailer must upgrade the engine version of a critical RDS for MySQL database. The database team needs a synchronized test environment, time to validate the new version, and a managed cutover with minimal downtime and risk of data loss. Which solution has the least operational overhead? Option A. Restore a native MySQL backup into a separately upgraded database and manually synchronize final changes. Option B. Take a manual snapshot and upgrade the production database directly. Option C. Create an Amazon RDS blue/green deployment, test the green environment, and perform a managed switchover. Option D. Use AWS DMS to build and operate a separate replication environment for the upgraded database. The correct answer is C. Create an Amazon RDS blue/green deployment, test the green environment, and perform a managed switchover. Here's why. RDS blue/green deployments create a synchronized staging environment for testing engine changes and provide a managed switchover with a short interruption. Why are the other options not correct? A. Backup and restore requires manual synchronization and a more complex cutover. B. Upgrading production directly does not provide an isolated synchronized environment for validation. D. DMS can replicate data, but adds migration infrastructure and operational management that blue/green deployments avoid. Exam tip. Use RDS blue/green deployments to validate database changes before a managed low downtime switchover. Question number 295. A multi-availability zone RDS for Postgres QLDB instance remains available, but increasing read-only queries are slowing the primary database. The company wants to add read capacity without weakening the existing high-availability configuration. What should a solutions architect do? Option A. Route application reads to the multi-availability zone standby instance. Option B. Create an RDS read replica and direct read-only queries to the replica. Option C. Place Kinesis data firehose between the application and the database. Option D. Enable S3 transfer acceleration for database client connections. The correct answer is B. Create an RDS read replica and direct read-only queries to the replica. Here's why. A read replica provides independent read capacity and offloads read-only queries from the primary, while the multi-availability zone standby continues to serve its failover role. Why are the other options not correct? A. A traditional multi-availability zone standby is not available for application read traffic. C. Firehose is a streaming delivery service and is not a relational database connection or query scaling layer. D. Transfer acceleration applies to Amazon S3 uploads and does not optimize Postgres QL queries. Exam tip. Use multi-availability zone for database availability and read replicas for read scaling. Question number 296. A company wants to retire 2 self-managed authoritative DNS servers that host about 200 zones. The replacement must handle approximately 1 million daily queries with high availability and minimal server administration. Which migration approach should be used? Option A. Move one DNS server to a large EC2 instance and use CloudWatch alarms for outages. Option B. Use AWS Application Migration Service to replicate both DNS servers into AWS and continue operating them. Option C. Run DNS software in an auto-scaling group with desired capacity 1 across 2 availability zones. Option D. Create Route 53 public hosted zones and import the existing zone files. The correct answer is D. Create Route 53 public hosted zones and import the existing zone files. Here's why. Route 53 is a managed, highly available authoritative DNS service. Importing the zone files removes operating system patching, DNS server scaling, and failover administration. Why are the other options not correct? A. A single EC2 DNS server remains a failure point and requires ongoing administration. B. Application Migration Service would preserve self-managed DNS servers instead of replacing them with managed authoritative DNS. C. A desired capacity of 1 leaves replacement delay and still requires managing DNS software. Exam tip. Use Route 53 hosted zones to replace self-managed authoritative DNS infrastructure. Question number 297. A containerized reconciliation job runs once each night and can take up to 2 hours. It must restart from the beginning after a failure. The company does not want to maintain idle compute capacity between runs. Which design is the most cost-effective? Option A. Run an ECS task on AWS Fargate and start it with an event bridge scheduled rule. Option B. Run the script on a continuously available reserved EC2 instance and invoke it through cron. Option C. Run the workload as a Lambda function invoked by event bridge. Option D. Run an ECS task on self-managed EC2 container instances and invoke it from event bridge. The correct answer is A. run an ECS task on AWS Fargate and start it with an event bridge scheduled rule. Here's why. A scheduled Fargate task can run for the required duration without a Lambda time limit and incurs compute charges only while the task is running, with no container hosts to maintain. Why are the other options not correct? B. The EC2 instance incurs ongoing cost for a job that runs only a small part of each day. C. Lambda's maximum execution duration is far shorter than 2 hours. D. ECS on EC2 requires provisioning and paying for container instances. Exam tip. Use scheduled Fargate tasks for periodic container workloads that exceed Lambda's execution limit. Question number 298. A manufacturing company stores 10 gigabytes of daily telemetry in an S3 bucket owned by a central data account. Several external consulting firms need to let their own analysts read selected objects. The company wants least privilege access without creating and maintaining identities for every external analyst. Which solution is most secure and operationally efficient? Option A. Temporarily enable public access to the bucket and send the URL only to the firms. Option B. Create an IAM user in the data account for every analyst. Option C. Grant cross-account S3 access to approved principals in each consulting firm's AWS account. Option D. Configure S3 global tables to create a copy for each consulting firm. The correct answer is C. Grant cross-account S3 access to approved principals in each consulting firm's AWS account. Here's why. Cross-account bucket and IAM policies can grant limited read access to agency-controlled roles while each firm retains responsibility for its own analyst identities and credential lifecycle. Why are the other options not correct? A. Public access is not limited to authenticated consulting firm principals. B. Individual source account IAM users create unnecessary long-term credential and lifecycle overhead. D. Amazon S3 has no global tables feature. Exam tip. Use cross-account roles and resource policies instead of creating IAM users for external personnel. Question number 299. A company serves SMB and NFS shares from FSx for NetApp on tap in its primary region. It needs a continuously maintained disaster recovery copy in a second region that can expose the same file protocols after activation with minimal custom operations. Which solution should be selected? Option A. Copy files to S3 with Lambda and enable S3 cross-region replication. Option B. Create FSx for ONTAP in the secondary region and replicate volumes with NetApp SnapMirror. Option C. Copy AWS backup recovery points to the second region and manually build a new file system only after a disaster. Option D. Migrate the data to Amazon EFS and replicate the EFS file system. The correct answer is B. Create FSx for ONTAP in the secondary region and replicate volumes with NetApp SnapMirror. Here's why. SnapMirror is the native ONTAP replication mechanism for scheduled cross-region volume replication. The destination remains an FSx for ONTAP system and can provide both SMB and NFS during recovery. Why are the other options not correct? A. The S3 workflow loses the native file system protocols and requires custom copy code. C. Backup copy and restore is a point-in-time recovery workflow with more activation steps than native replication. D. EFS does not provide SMB and would require a protocol and platform migration. Exam tip. Use SnapMirror for protocol-preserving disaster recovery between FSx for ONTAP file systems. Question number 300. An S3 bucket publishes object-created events to an SNS topic. Traffic can arrive in large bursts, and Lambda processing must scale independently while retaining events for retries. What should a solutions architect add? Option A. Subscribe an ECS service to SNS and make it forward each notification to Lambda. Option B. Subscribe an EKS workload to SNS and use it as a pre-processing layer for Lambda. Option C. Send SNS notifications to an event bridge bus and configure Lambda to pull the bus. Option D. Subscribe an SQS to the SNS topic and configure the queue as a Lambda event source. The correct answer is D. Subscribe an SQSQ to the SNS topic and configure the queue as a Lambda event source. Here's why. SQS durably buffers SNS notifications, absorbs bursts, supports redelivery, and lets Lambda pull records in batches while scaling consumers independently from event arrival. Why are the other options not correct? A. ECS adds unnecessary infrastructure and does not provide the intended managed durable queue. B. EKS adds cluster operations without solving the buffering requirement efficiently. C. Lambda is invoked by Event Bridge as a target. It does not pull an Event Bridge bus as a queue. Exam tip. Place SQS between event publishers and Lambda when durable buffering, retries, and independent scaling are required. Question number 301. A digital insurance platform is adding a public API by using Amazon API Gateway. Traffic is highly irregular and can jump from no requests to more than 500 requests per second without warning. The backend currently stores less than 1 gigabytes, but both traffic and data volume can grow unpredictably. The access pattern consists of simple key-value operations. Which two services provide the most operationally efficient architecture? Choose 2. Option A. Use a MySQL-compatible Amazon Aurora cluster for the data tier. Option B. Run the request processing code in AWS Lambda. Option C. Run the request processing code as containers on AWS Fargate. Option D. Store the application data in Amazon DynamoDB. E. Run the request processing tier in an Amazon EC2 auto-scaling group. The correct answer is B. Run the request processing code in AWS Lambda. D. Store the application data in Amazon DynamoDB. Here's why. Lambda automatically scales for sudden event-driven API traffic, including scaling down when idle. DynamoDB is a fully managed key-value database that scales independently as request volume and stored data increase. Why are the other options not correct? A. Aurora is a relational database and adds unnecessary relational infrastructure for a simple key-value access pattern. C. Fargate can run containers, but it requires an ECS service and more configuration than a direct Lambda integration. E. EC2 auto-scaling introduces instance startup time and server management overhead. Exam tip. For unpredictable AP is with key-value data, API Gateway, Lambda, and DynamoDB form a highly elastic serverless pattern. Question number 302. A pharmaceutical research organization stores datasets in a private Amazon S3 bucket. Employees in many countries occasionally need to upload new files or download approved objects. The company wants time-limited access without creating and managing long-term AWS credentials for every employee. Which solution meets the requirement with the least operational overhead? Option A. Deploy AWS Transfer Family SFTP endpoints with a custom identity provider and store employee credentials in AWS Secrets Manager. Option B. Use an AWS Lambda function to generate S3 pre-signed URLs for the required upload or download operations. Option C. Create an IAM user and an individual S3 access policy for every employee. Option D. Deploy S3 file gateway and require employees to mount separate upload and download shares. The correct answer is B. Use an AWS Lambda function to generate S3 pre-signed URLs for the required upload or download operations. Here's why. A pre-signed URL grants temporary access to a specific S3 operation while the bucket remains private. Employees do not need AWS access keys or IAM identities. Why are the other options not correct? A. Transfer family and a custom identity provider introduce endpoint and credential management overhead. C. Per employee IAM users create long-term credential, rotation, and offboarding work. D. File Gateway is designed for hybrid file system integration and requires gateway infrastructure. Exam tip. Use pre-signed URLs for temporary, narrowly scoped S3 access without distributing AWS credentials. Question number 303. A product catalog application runs on EC2 instances in several availability zones behind an application load balancer. Monitoring shows that one target receives a disproportionate number of requests from repeat clients, causing higher latency on that instance. The target group has session affinity enabled. What should a solutions architect do first to distribute requests more evenly? Option A. Add more EC2 instances to every availability zone. Option B. Disable sticky sessions on the application load balancer target group. Option C. Replace the application load balancer with a network load balancer. Option D. Run target group health checks more frequently. The correct answer is B. Disable sticky sessions on the application load balancer target group. Here's why. Sticky sessions repeatedly send a client to the same target. Disabling affinity allows the ALB to distribute subsequent requests across healthy targets more evenly. Why are the other options not correct? A. Additional targets can still receive uneven traffic while client affinity remains enabled. C. An NLB does not address the application-level stickiness configuration and removes Layer 7 routing features. D. Health check frequency changes failure detection, not normal request distribution. Exam tip. When ALB targets are unevenly loaded because of client affinity, remove stickiness unless the application requires it. Question number 304. A Lambda function reads objects from Amazon S3 that are encrypted with a customer-managed AWS KMS key. The function must decrypt the objects during execution. Which two permission configurations are required? Choose two. Option A. Allow the Lambda execution role to use the key in the KMS key policy. Option B. Add KMS. Decrypt to the Lambda function resource-based policy. Option C. Attach an IAM execution role that grants KMS. Decrypt to the Lambda function. Option D. Attach an IAM policy containing KMS. Decrypt directly to the Lambda function resource. E. Authorize the Lambda resource-based policy as a principal in the KMS key policy. The correct answer is A. Allow the Lambda execution role to use the key in the KMS key policy. C. Attach an IAM execution role that grants KMS. Decrypt to the Lambda function. Here's why. The function calls KMS by using its execution role credentials. The role needs KMS. Decrypt in an identity policy, and the KMS key policy must authorize the role or enable IAM-based delegation for that key. Why are the other options not correct? B. A Lambda resource policy controls who can invoke the function, not which AWS AP is the function code can call. D. Identity policies are attached to IAM identities such as roles, not directly to a Lambda function resource. E. The function resource policy is not the IAM principal that calls KMS. Exam tip. KMS access commonly requires both caller permission in IAM and authorization through the KMS key policy. Question number 305. A company uses consolidated billing through AWS organizations. Once each month, the finance team must run detailed SQL analysis across cost and usage data for every member account. The solution should scale without maintaining a continuously running analytics cluster. Which design is the most cost-effective? Option A. Create separate cost and usage reports in every member account, store them in Amazon S3, and analyze them with Amazon Redshift. Option B. Create the cost and usage report in the management account, deliver it to Amazon S3, and query it with Amazon Athena. Option C. Send management account billing data to Amazon Kinesis and process it with an Amazon EMR cluster. Option D. Send member account billing records to Amazon Kinesis and analyze them directly with Amazon QuickSight. The correct answer is B. Create the cost and usage report in the management account, deliver it to Amazon S3, and query it with Amazon Athena. Here's why. The management account can produce consolidated cost data for the organization. S3 stores the reports durably, and Athena provides serverless SQL that incurs query cost only when the monthly analysis runs. Why are the other options not correct? A. Separate reports and a continuously provisioned Redshift cluster add cost and administration. C. Kinesis and EMR are unnecessary for a monthly batch analysis requirement. D. cost and usage reports are delivered to S3, and QuickSight is a visualization layer rather than the primary raw report query engine. Exam tip. For intermittent detailed billing analysis, deliver consolidated cost reports to S3 and query them with Athena. Question number 306. A media company stores tens of gigabytes of access logs each day from multiple websites. Developers need to run standard SQL queries across several months of logs approximately once per week. The company wants to avoid paying for an always-on database or analytics cluster. Which solution is the most cost-effective? Option A. Index all logs in Amazon OpenSearch service and query the OpenSearch cluster. Option B. Store the logs in Amazon S3 and query them on demand with Amazon Athena. Option C. Load the logs into Amazon RDS and use a database client for analysis. Option D. Maintain an Amazon EMR cluster and use a SQL-compatible processing framework. The correct answer is B. Store the logs in Amazon S3 and query them on demand with Amazon Athena. Here's why. S3 provides low-cost, scalable log storage, and Athena executes standard SQL directly against S3 data without provisioning servers. Why are the other options not correct? A. OpenSearch requires continuously running cluster capacity for an intermittent workload. C. RDS is inefficient and costly for a growing append-only log archive. D. EMR adds cluster provisioning and administration for weekly ad hoc queries. Exam tip. Use S3 and Athena for intermittent serverless SQL analysis of large log datasets. Question number 307. A global retailer serves public websites through an application load balancer. The company uses the Apex domain retail.example and first-level country subdomains, such as uk.retail.example and jp.retail.example. All browser traffic must use a publicly trusted TLS certificate that renews with minimal administration. Which two actions should the solutions architect take? Choose 2. Option A. Request a private ACM certificate for retail.example and star.retail.example. Option B. Request a public ACM certificate that includes retail.example and star.retail.example. Option C. Request separate public and private certificates only for retail.example. Option D. Validate by email first and later convert the issued certificate to DNS validation. E. Add the ACM DNS validation records to the authoritative DNS provider. The correct answer is B. Request a public ACM certificate that includes retail.example and star.retail.example. E. Add the ACM DNS validation records to the authoritative DNS provider. Here's why. The public certificate is trusted by internet browsers and covers both the Apex name and first-level subdomains. Persistent DNS validation records allow ACM to renew the certificate automatically. Why are the other options not correct? A. A private ACM certificate is not automatically trusted by public browsers. C. Certificates for only the Apex name do not cover the country subdomains. D. The validation method of an issued ACM certificate cannot be converted from email to DNS. Exam tip. Include both the Apex and wildcard names, and use DNS validation for managed ACM renewal. Question number 308. A regulated organization must retain its cryptographic key material in an on-premises key management platform. AWS services should call AWS KMS for encryption operations, but the underlying keys must remain outside AWS and the design must support external key managers from multiple vendors. Which solution has the least operational overhead? Option A. Use the default AWS KMS key store. Option B. Create an AWS KMS custom key store backed by an AWS Cloud HSM cluster. Option C. Configure an AWS KMS external key store backed by the on-premises key manager. Option D. Use keys directly in an AWS Cloud HSM cluster. The correct answer is C. Configure an AWS KMS external key store backed by the on-premises key manager. Here's why. A KMS external key store integrates KMS with externally retained key material through the external key store proxy model, allowing supported vendor key managers to remain the cryptographic authority. Why are the other options not correct? A. The default KMS key store keeps protected key material within AWS KMS. B. A Cloud HSM custom key store uses key material in AWS Cloud HSM appliances inside AWS. D. Cloud HSM also places the keys in AWS managed data center hardware rather than the on-premises manager. Exam tip. Choose a KMS external key store when regulatory requirements mandate that key material remain outside AWS. Question number 309. A scientific simulation will run across hundreds of EC2 instances. All nodes need simultaneous access to the same large datasets through a parallel file system with sub-millisecond latency. After the simulation, analysts must continue working with the results from durable object storage. Which architecture meets these requirements? Option A. Use Amazon EFS as the shared processing file system. Option B. Mount an Amazon S3 bucket directly as the native parallel file system. Option C. Use Amazon FSx for Lustre and link the file system to an Amazon S3 bucket. Option D. Share an S3 bucket with AWS Resource Access Manager and mount it on every EC2 instance. The correct answer is C. Use Amazon FSx for Lustre and link the file system to an Amazon S3 bucket. Here's why. FSx for Lustre is designed for highly parallel, low-latency access from many compute nodes. Its S3 integration supports importing datasets and exporting results for durable post-processing access. Why are the other options not correct? A. EFS is shared NFS storage but is not optimized for this sub-millisecond parallel HPC access pattern. B. S3 is object storage and is not a native high-performance parallel file system. D. AWS RAM does not convert an S3 bucket into a mountable Lustre-compatible file system. Exam tip. Use FSx for Lustre for parallel HPC input-output and integrate it with S3 for durable dataset exchange. Question number 310. A climate modeling platform requires a shared file system for thousands of EC2 compute nodes. The workload needs sub-millisecond latency, sustained high throughput, simultaneous access to hundreds of gigabytes, and greater resilience than temporary scratch storage. Which storage configuration should be selected? Option A. Use Amazon EFS with provisioned throughput mode. Option B. Use an Amazon FSx for Lustre scratch file system. Option C. Use an Amazon FSx for Lustre persistent file system. Option D. Use Amazon EFS with bursting throughput mode. The correct answer is C. Use an Amazon FSx for Lustre persistent file system. Here's why. A persistent FSx for Lustre file system provides HPC-optimized latency and throughput while using replicated file server infrastructure for improved resilience and long-lived data. Why are the other options not correct? A. EFS is general-purpose NFS storage and does not match the required Lustre-scale HPC performance. B. Scratch file systems are optimized for temporary processing and do not replicate data. D. EFS bursting performance depends on stored capacity and is not designed for this sustained HPC profile. Exam tip. Use persistent FSx for Lustre when HPC performance must be combined with more resilient, long-lived storage. Question number 311. An organization is migrating a PostgreSQL transactional database to Amazon RDS. Peak storage demand is 15,000 IOPS. The team wants to configure IOPS independently from allocated storage capacity and meet the requirement at the lowest supported storage cost. Which RDS storage option should be used? Option A. Select General Purpose SSD GP2 and provision 15,000 IOPS independently of capacity. Option B. Select Provisioned IOPS SSD IO1 and configure 15,000 IOPS. Option C. Select General Purpose SSD GP3 and configure 15,000 IOPS. Option D. Select Magnetic Storage and tune it for 15,000 IOPS. The correct answer is C. Select General Purpose SSD GP3 and configure 15,000 IOPS. Here's why. RDS GP3 decouples provisioned IOPS from storage capacity and can support the required performance at a lower price than provisioned IOPS storage when the requirement is within GP3 limits. Why are the other options not correct? A. GP2 IOPS scale with allocated storage and cannot be independently provisioned, as described. B. IO1 can meet the IOPS target, but generally costs more than GP3 for this requirement. D. Magnetic storage cannot provide the required high, predictable IOPS. Exam tip. Use RDS GP3 when performance must be provisioned independently and the required IOPS remain within GP3 limits. Question number 312. A company is moving a Microsoft SQL Server Enterprise Edition transactional database to AWS. Reporting teams currently run analytical queries against the production database and affect application performance. The company wants to preserve SQL Server compatibility, offload reporting, and minimize database administration. Which solution best meets the requirements? Option A. Run SQL Server on Amazon EC2 and configure always-on readable secondary replicas. Option B. Migrate to Amazon RDS for SQL Server and direct reporting queries to supported read replicas. Option C. Redesign the database for Amazon DynamoDB and use on-demand capacity for reporting. Option D. Migrate to Amazon Aurora MySQL and use Aurora replicas for reports. The correct answer is B. Migrate to Amazon RDS for SQL Server and direct reporting queries to supported read replicas. Here's why. RDS for SQL Server preserves the database engine, while AWS manages infrastructure and common administration. Supported SQL Server read replicas can isolate read-only reporting from the primary transactional instance. Why are the other options not correct? A. SQL Server on EC2 leaves operating system, database, backup, and high availability management to the company. C. DynamoDB requires a NoSQL data model and application redesign. D. Aurora MySQL requires an engine migration and potential application changes. Exam tip. When engine compatibility is mandatory, use supported managed read replicas to separate reporting from transactional traffic. Question number 313. A critical analytics job runs for 6 hours every day on Amazon EMR. HDFS data used during processing must not be lost if an interruptible instance is reclaimed. The company wants to avoid paying for the cluster during the remaining 18 hours. Which configuration is the most cost-effective? Option A. Create a transient cluster with the primary and core nodes on on-demand instances and task nodes on spot instances. Option B. Keep a long-running cluster with on-demand primary and core nodes and spot task nodes. Option C. Create a transient cluster with an on-demand primary node and spot core and task nodes. Option D. Keep a long-running cluster with an on-demand primary node and spot core and task nodes. The correct answer is A. Create a transient cluster with the primary and core nodes on on-demand instances and task nodes on spot instances. Here's why. A transient cluster exists only for the daily job. Reliable on-demand primary and core nodes protect cluster coordination and HDFS data, while replaceable spot task nodes reduce compute cost. Why are the other options not correct? B. A long-running cluster accrues charges while idle for most of the day. C. Spot core node interruption can remove HDFS blocks and threaten the job data. D. This design combines unnecessary idle cost with the data loss risk of spot core nodes. Exam tip. Use on-demand capacity for EMR primary and core nodes when data cannot be lost, and use spot for replaceable task nodes. Question number 314. A research laboratory is migrating latency-sensitive HPC applications and an on-premises NAS platform to AWS. Compute nodes communicate heavily with one another, and the managed file service must expose the same dataset concurrently through both NFS and SMB. Which two design choices provide the lowest latency while meeting the protocol requirement? Choose 2. Option A. Use Amazon FSx for NetApp ONTAP for the shared file system. Option B. Place compute-optimized EC2 instances in a cluster placement group. Option C. Place compute-optimized EC2 instances in a partition placement group. Option D. Use Amazon FSx for Lustre for the shared file system. E. Use Amazon FSx for OpenZFS for the shared file system. The correct answer is A. Use Amazon FSx for NetApp ONTAP for the shared file system. B. Place compute-optimized EC2 instances in a cluster placement group. Here's why. A cluster placement group places instances close together for low-latency networking. FSx for NetApp ONTAP supports multi-protocol access, including NFS and SMB, to manage file system data. Why are the other options not correct? C. A partition placement group isolates groups of instances on separate hardware instead of minimizing all node-to-node latency. D. FSx for Lustre is optimized for HPC, but does not provide the required SMB multi-protocol access. E. FSx for OpenZFS provides NFS access, but not native SMB access. Exam tip. Combine cluster placement for tightly coupled compute with FSx for ONTAP when the same data requires NFS and SMB. Question number 315. An application runs as Amazon ECS tasks in AVPC. Static assets are stored in Amazon S3, and sensitive relational data is stored in Amazon RDS for MySQL. Security policy requires that only the application tasks can read the S3 objects and establish database connections. Which design most directly enforces both requirements? Option A. Encrypt S3 and RDS with one customer-managed KMS key and grant the ECS task role permission to use the key. Option B. Restrict the S3 bucket policy to the ECS task role and configure the RDS security group to allow the database port only from the security group attached to the ECS tasks. Option C. Restrict the S3 bucket to requests through a shared S3 VPC endpoint and allow the RDS port from all private subnet CIDR ranges. Option D. Encrypt both services with AWS-managed KMS keys and identify the ECS task role as the only principal in the S3 bucket policy. The correct answer is B. Restrict the S3 bucket policy to the ECS task role and configure the RDS security group to allow the database port only from the security group attached to the ECS tasks. Here's why. The S3 bucket policy provides identity-based restriction to the application task role. A security group rule that references the ECS task security group limits database network access to task ENIs rather than every resource in a subnet. Why are the other options not correct? A. Encryption authorization does not by itself prevent other permitted principals or network clients from accessing the data. C. Other resources can use the shared endpoint or private subnet CIDRs, so access is not limited to ECS tasks. D. This option does not restrict RDS network connectivity to the ECS tasks. Exam tip. Use IAM or bucket policies for S3 authorization and security group references for workload to database network access. Question number 316. A compute-intensive web application experiences unpredictable peaks approximately twice each month. At the start of each event, CPU demand rises to 10 times its normal level. The company will deploy the application with AWS Elastic Beanstalk and wants automatic scaling without knowing the event schedule. Which environment configuration best meets the requirement? Option A. Use compute-optimized instances and scale the environment from an application request metric. Option B. Use burstable performance instances in unlimited mode and scale from the request metric. Option C. Use compute-optimized instances and add scheduled scaling actions. Option D. Use burstable performance instances in unlimited mode and rely on predictive scaling. The correct answer is A. Use compute-optimized instances and scale the environment from an application request metric. Here's why. Compute-optimized instances match the sharp CPU-heavy workload. Metric-based scaling responds whenever request demand increases, without requiring the peak times to be known in advance. Why are the other options not correct? B. Burstable instances rely on CPU credits and are a poorer fit for a sustained tenfold CPU increase. C. Scheduled scaling requires predictable event times, which the scenario does not provide. D. Predictive scaling depends on repeatable historical patterns and does not fix the instance family mismatch. Exam tip. Use metric-driven scaling for unpredictable demand and select an EC2 family that matches the measured resource bottleneck. Question number 317. A manufacturer has an AWS Direct Connect connection from its data center to a VPC. Applications in the VPC and systems on premises must access Amazon S3 without sending S3 traffic through the public internet. Which endpoint design satisfies both access paths? Option A. Create an S3 gateway endpoint and use it for both VPC and on-premises clients. Option B. Create an S3 interface VPC endpoint and route on-premises access to its private IP addresses over Direct Connect. Option C. Attach Amazon S3 directly to AWS Transit Gateway. Option D. Encrypt the S3 objects with AWS KMS and continue using the public S3 endpoint. The correct answer is B. Create an S3 interface VPC endpoint and route on-premises access to its private IP addresses over Direct Connect. Here's why. An S3 interface endpoint provides private IP addresses in the VPC. Those addresses can be reached by VPC resources and by on-premises networks through Direct Connect and appropriate DNS and routing. Why are the other options not correct? A. Gateway endpoints are used through associated VPC route tables and are not directly reachable from on-premises networks. C. Transit Gateway does not provide a service attachment directly to S3. D. Encryption protects data but does not create a private network path. Exam tip. Use an S3 interface endpoint when private S3 connectivity must extend to on-premises networks. Question number 318. A company observes that EBS snapshot charges grow every month even though provision volume capacity is stable. The company wants to remove unnecessary recovery points and prevent future snapshot accumulation with minimal administration. Which solution should be implemented? Option A. Delete every snapshot that appears in used without creating an ongoing retention policy. Option B. Delete non-essential snapshots and use Amazon Data Lifecycle Manager to automate snapshot creation, retention, and expiration. Option C. Write a custom disk usage script and use elastic volumes to shrink each EBS volume. Option D. Monitor file system utilization in CloudWatch logs and reduce EBS volume sizes with elastic volumes. The correct answer is B. Delete non-essential snapshots and use Amazon Data Lifecycle Manager to automate snapshot creation, retention, and expiration. Here's why. Deleting unneeded snapshots immediately reduces storage charges. Data Lifecycle Manager then applies consistent schedules and retention rules automatically. Why are the other options not correct? A. A one-time cleanup does not prevent future snapshot growth. C. A custom script adds operational work, and EBS volumes cannot be reduced in size. D. CloudWatch does not natively provide guest file system utilization, and elastic volumes cannot shrink volumes. Exam tip. Use Data Lifecycle Manager to automate EBS snapshot schedules and expiration after cleaning up unnecessary recovery points. Question number 319. An organization maintains a database that maps employee identities to cost center codes. Every resource created in a particular AWS account must be tagged with the cost center of the user who made the create request. The solution must react automatically to resource creation activity. Which architecture best meets the requirement? Option A. Match resource creation CloudTrail events with Amazon EventBridge and invoke a Lambda function that looks up the creator in the database and applies the tag. Option B. Attach an SCP that queries the database and inserts the correct cost center tag before resource creation. Option C. Run a scheduled cloud formation stack that periodically deploys a tagging Lambda function. Option D. Invoke a Lambda function for untagged resources and apply one default cost center value to every resource. The correct answer is A. Match resource creation CloudTrail events with Amazon EventBridge and invoke a Lambda function that looks up the creator in the database and applies the tag. Here's why. CloudTrail records the calling identity for API activity. EventBridge can react to creation events, and Lambda can map the identity to the correct cost center before applying the resource tag. Why are the other options not correct? B. SCPs cannot query an external database or add tags after an API request. C. A scheduled stack does not react to each creation event or identify the creator. D. A default value does not satisfy the user-specific cost center mapping. Exam tip. Combine CloudTrail, EventBridge, and Lambda for event-driven governance that depends on API caller identity. Question number 320. An online learning platform runs on EC2 instances in an auto-scaling group. Demand rises at the same time every day, and users experience slow responses during the first hour because additional instances are launched only after utilization increases. Which scaling approach ensures capacity is ready when the daily peak begins? Option A. Create a scheduled scaling action that increases desired capacity before the peak starts. Option B. Add an application load balancer without changing the auto-scaling policy. Option C. Use a dynamic policy that scales only after CPU utilization rises. Option D. Publish memory metrics and scale only after memory utilization rises. The correct answer is A. Create a scheduled scaling action that increases desired capacity before the peak starts. Here's why. Because the peak time is predictable, scheduled scaling can launch and initialize instances before requests arrive, avoiding reactive scale-out delay. Why are the other options not correct? B. A load balancer distributes traffic but does not add compute capacity. C. CPU-based dynamic scaling reacts after demand begins and users already experience latency. D. Memory-based scaling is also reactive and requires custom metrics. Exam tip. Use scheduled scaling to prepare for recurring demand and dynamic scaling for unpredictable changes. Question number 321. A museum publishes a searchable archive of historical photographs. Each image is viewed only once or twice per year, but users must be able to retrieve any image immediately. The storage service must remain highly available without maintaining web servers. Which design is the most cost-effective? Option A. Store the images in S3 standard IA and deliver them through an S3 static website endpoint. Option B. Store the images in Amazon EFS and serve them from an EC2 web server. Option C. Store the images in S3 standard and deliver them through an S3 static website endpoint. Option D. Store the images on EBS volumes attached to an EC2 web server. The correct answer is A. Store the images in S3 standard IA and deliver them through an S3 static website endpoint. Here's why. S3 standard IA provides immediate retrieval and multi-availability zone resilience at lower storage cost for predictably infrequent access. Why are the other options not correct? B. EFS and EC2 introduce file system and compute charges for an object delivery workload. C. S3 standard provides the required availability but costs more for data retrieved only a few times per year. D. EBS and a single web tier are less scalable and require server administration. Exam tip. Use standard IA for infrequently accessed objects that still require immediate retrieval and multi-availability zone storage. Question number 322. A global enterprise has many AWS accounts and VPCs. Security groups throughout the organization must allow traffic from a centrally maintained list of corporate office site ranges. Offices are added and removed regularly, and the company wants one update to propagate wherever the list is referenced. Which solution is the most cost-effective? Option A. Create security groups in the organization's management account and attach them directly to resources in every member account VPC. Option B. Use AWS Firewall Manager to distribute a common security group policy for every VPC. Option C. Create a customer-managed prefix list, share it through AWS RAM, and reference the prefix list in security group rules. Option D. Modify an AWS managed prefix list with a Lambda function and use Security Hub to distribute it. The correct answer is C. Create a customer-managed prefix list, share it through AWS RAM, and reference the prefix list in security group rules. Here's why. A customer-managed prefix list provides one reusable collection of SIDRs. AWS RAM can share it with organization accounts, and changes are inherited by security group rules that reference the list. Why are the other options not correct? A. Security groups in one account cannot simply be attached across unrelated VPCs in all accounts. B. Firewall Manager can enforce centralized policies, but adds more service complexity and cost than a shared CIDR list. D. Customers cannot modify AWS managed prefix lists, and Security Hub does not distribute security group rules. Exam tip. Use shared customer-managed prefix lists when many security groups need the same centrally maintained SIDRs. Question number 323. A company uses Amazon RDS for PostgreSQL and must change the database master credential every 30 days. The security team wants managed secret storage and automated rotation without maintaining custom code. Which solution has the least operational overhead? Option A. Schedule a custom Lambda function with EventBridge to change and redistribute the password. Option B. Store and manage the RDS credentials in AWS Secrets Manager and configure automatic rotation. Option C. Run the ModifyDB instance AWS CLI command manually every 30 days. Option D. Store the credential in Systems Manager Parameter Store and rely on Parameter Store to rotate it. The correct answer is B. Store and manage the RDS credentials in AWS Secrets Manager and configure automatic rotation. Here's why. Secrets Manager provides managed credential storage and an RDS integrated rotation workflow that can update the secret and database password on a schedule. Why are the other options not correct? A. A custom rotation function duplicates managed functionality and requires maintenance. C. A CLI command requires manual execution or additional automation and secret distribution. D. Parameter Store does not provide the same native managed RDS password rotation workflow. Exam tip. Use Secrets Manager when a database secret requires managed storage and automatic rotation. Question number 324. Development teams access multiple AWS accounts through IAM Identity Center. Every resource for an application must use an application name tag, whose value comes from an approved organization-wide list. The company wants supported create operations to reject non-compliant values centrally. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Create and enforce an AWS organization's tag policy that defines the permitted application name values for supported resource types. Option B. Create an IAM group with a conditional allow policy and add all IAM Identity Center users to the group. Option C. Create a cross-account role that denies access whenever a resource contains the application name tag. Option D. Create an AWS resource group to validate tags after resources are created. The correct answer is A. Create and enforce an AWS organization's tag policy that defines the permitted application name values for supported resource types. Here's why. An enforced tag policy can standardize a tag key and its allowed values across organization accounts and prevent supported tagging operations that use non-compliant values. Why are the other options not correct? B. An IAM group in one account does not centrally govern IAM Identity Center permissions across all accounts. C. Denying resources that contain the tag reverses the intended requirement. D. Resource groups organizes resources but does not prevent creation with an unapproved tag value. Exam tip. Use enforced organizations' tag policies to standardize and restrict tag values across supported resources. You have completed Part 9 of the SAA-C03 practice series. Continue your preparation by opening the complete playlist and watching the remaining parts in sequence. Please like this video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam preparation content. Share your score, questions, or feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.